Hi, everyone. So we are at week 5, and I'm starting to get a sense of what's working and what's not working. And one of the things that I wanted to revisit was deontology. Looking through some of the work that you've all turned in, and you've received many comments from me, the work suggests that we need to revisit deontology. I think what you're absolutely understanding in terms of what deontology is that it's very rule-based. It's not so much based on consequences. It's rule-based, and that we ought to follow a particular rule because it's just the right thing to do. And that's important. What I want to make sure you get, and what you're going to be held accountable for later in the semester, is that you understand and have a clear idea of why that rule exists and not some other rule. In other words, the deontological perspective actually gives us the tools to reason out what the correct ethical action is. And so I want to talk just a little bit about that to make sure that we shore up our understanding and that you have a good idea of how to do that on your own. So the first thing that I want to draw attention to is that in this course, which is really an introductory course in ethics, there's really been 2 deontological perspectives that we've offered in any kind of depth whatsoever to allow you to actually make decisions in terms of ethics. And one of those comes from the philosopher Kant, Immanuel Kant. And Kant asked us to be attentive to the following formulation. If I could will it so that everybody followed this course of action, if I could will it that everybody made this decision, would that make sense? Would the world make sense? Would it work? That's the fundamental question that you should be asking yourself. And then, of course, Kant brings into light this question of lying, and why is lying morally wrong? It's not wrong just because you have a personal dislike to be deceived. It's not wrong because it was told to you that it was wrong. There's lots of things that are told to us or that we're taught that are wrong, and maybe they're not necessarily wrong, or they're not wrong in every circumstance. What Kant was saying is that lying is wrong because if you could will it so that everybody had the option of lying at all times, or that everybody did lie at all times, the very distinction between lying and telling the truth would kind of fall apart. We would just interact in a society where we expected people to lie constantly, and that in itself is a problem. It wouldn't work. Nobody would trust anybody, and everything would kind of collapse on itself. So that's why lying is wrong. But I want to bring this a little bit closer to home, and I want to offer you a different example because everybody offers the example of lying. Another example, you'll recall that procedural justice is the quality of treatment police give to citizens involving things like dialogue with citizens, demonstrated neutrality when dealing with citizens, and they show respect when dealing with citizens, and they show trustworthiness. And that's part of the overall ethics of the criminal justice system, and arguably it's a part that we should probably pay more attention to. But let's focus on that for our example. When considering procedural justice, what Kant would encourage us to say is, would it make sense if I could will it that every police officer engaged with citizens without any semblance of procedural justice? And I think what Kant would say, it's certainly where I weigh in on this, is that the answer is no. Because if police officers acted without giving citizens any kind of procedural justice, if all police officers did this, then you'd have a serious problem of legitimacy. And we've talked about this before. Legitimate authority would break down because police would be seen as abusing their power. Or if you want to take it away from legitimacy and focus on a related topic of trustworthiness, would police be trusted if you could will it so that every police officer had disregard for respecting citizens? And I think that you would encounter a serious problem of trust. And as many of you know, if you don't have trust as a police officer within the community that you're policing, you're not going to be able to accomplish your duties. So for Kant, that that reasoning there is the reason that it's ethically wrong, because in this little thought experiment, it's not going to work if you could will it so that everybody behaved that way. I want to switch gears to Rawls now, who also followed a deontological type of reasoning. And here again, I want to consider procedural justice as an example. So we're going to kind of stick with the same example, and I'm going to show you how Rawls' type of thinking is going to lead us to a conclusion in a slightly different way. Recall that procedural justice refers to the quality of treatment police give to citizens involving dialogue with citizens, a demonstrated neutrality, respect, and trustworthiness. And what Rawls asks us to do is to focus on something called the original position. And the original position is that the principles that free and rational persons concerned to further their own interests would accept in an initial position of equality as defining the fundamental terms of their association. Basically, he's asking us to imagine a position that we might take, except it's not really us, it's the us before we had any kind of bias in the world. And so it is the position, the original position that we might take if we were both free and rational, and we were simply making decisions out of our own interests. But then we were also in dialogue with other people who were making decisions out of their own interest, and recognizing that sometimes those interests would contradict with one another. And what Rawls was saying then is it sort of the compromises that we might come to in this unbiased environment, again, where we're free and rational and able to make decisions, that it's those types of decisions in this hypothetical universe that would be fair and that would represent justice. Now, to get at this, what Rawls was asking is that among the essential features of this situation in the original position is that no one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensity. The principles of justice are chosen behind what Rawls called a veil of ignorance. And so if we're occupying the original position, that means we're operating behind a veil of ignorance. We don't know how well we're going to fare once society starts. But when we design society and we are all truly equal with one another, it is the decisions that we come to together that represent justice. So Rawls is also asking us to do a little bit of a thought experiment. And he's saying, now, how would you act in the world? And I think that one could argue that the idea of procedural justice, that we would want police who treated citizens with basic respect, that offered them some trust, that engaged them in dialogue, that those sorts of characteristics of procedural justice, that would be the kind of consensus opinion among people who were operating under a veil of ignorance. And so Rawls, in his deontological perspective, encourages us to arrive at the same conclusion. Now, as I've already said, it's worth pausing for a second to point out that in both these cases, there is a bit of a thought experiment happening. And again, for Kant, that thought experiment is the idea that you should always ask yourself if you could will it so that everybody behaved in this way. And if that logically made sense, then it's the ethical thing to do. If it doesn't logically make sense, if that makes no sense at all, that everybody would behave that way, then it's ethically the wrong thing to do. Rawls was doing something a little bit more sophisticated in my view, which is he's asking people to occupy this original position. Somehow this fantasy world before society was developed and everybody in the equal status was coming together and thinking what would be the best. I don't have any interests, I don't have any biases. and either do you, and we're going to work together to find out what the best thing to do is. That's an original position, and it's the place where you're going to get truly just decisions. And Rawls is asking, well, if you want to know if something's ethical, ask if that's the decision you would arrive at under those circumstances. That's deontology. And those are the key, that's the key for how you arrive at decisions about what's ethical and what's not ethical. Okay, so I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk about something that we have come increasingly into contact with. You may be discussing it in some of your other classes, but it's incredibly important, and it's going to be, I think, one of these watershed moments in our course because it really helps us to expand our ability to make ethical decisions in all the complexity that we have in the world. And that topic is empiricism. Empiricism, for those who don't know, is the theory that all knowledge is derived from sense experience. What does that mean? It means that I can't call something real. I can't call something as a trend that's real or as a reality that I'm living with until I can verify it exists through the five senses. As it turns out, we have more than five senses, but let's not quibble. The point here is that only if I can see it, taste it, smell it, touch it, if it somehow can be perceived in a measurable way, and it's not just a figment of my rational thinking, then it belongs within our empirical base of knowledge. And the idea here is that for those who are strong supporters of empiricism, taking note of empirical knowledge and rejecting anything that doesn't have empirical evidence is the only way that we can kind of find truth in the world. Now, this is in contrast to something called rationalism. And rationalism, you may not be familiar of in terms of the term, but rationalism you'll recognize because it's kind of what we've been doing already. Kant was a rationalist, and Kant's thought experiment, as well as Rawls' thought experiments, were in the tradition of rationalism. You use logical deduction, you use principles of formal logic, and you try to find out the correct answer through your pure reasoning ability. And empiricism kind of rejects that as the method or the way about finding knowledge, and wants to know instead, what is it that I can see, touch, feel, and hear, and measure? And that's what I want to use as my data to build and find what the ultimate truth is. Little by little, we're going to chip away at it with more and more research, experimental studies in particular. One of the ethical problems that one might encounter in their career is whether a given problem is the result of a few bad apples or whether it's actually a symptom of something more systematic. And the only way you're going to be able to figure that out is through empirical knowledge, okay? So you're going to actually look at data that's been collected in an intelligent way to deduce whether the particular act is patterned or if it's kind of a one-off. And if it's a one-off, you're going to deal with that in a very different way than if it's patterned. So I want you to consider, for example, the question of whether one should implement policies that reduce the use of lethal force in policing. And there's a number of different ways in which you could go about that. That's all important to be discovered. But the original kind of ethical dilemma is, should I, as a chief of police or as a policymaker, implement a policy that aims to reduce the use of lethal force among the police officers that serve under me? And this is an important ethical dilemma because on the one hand, it may satisfy the calls of a citizenry or the public who is becoming increasingly frustrated at people being killed in altercations with police. On the other hand, it could have very serious implications for officers who rely on the power of using lethal force when they deem to be necessary in order to protect their own lives. So this is kind of this classical ethical dilemma. And what I want to suggest to you is that the deontological reasoning, while it may serve as something as an important guide, but empirical data is going to be very important here as well. And for that, I want to share with you this slide of violent crimes and rates of police killings by police in America's 50 largest cities. And this data was taken from 2013 to 2018. It lists each of the US cities below on the bottom x-axis, and on the y-axis, it lists average violent crime rate per 1,000 population. The red squares are police killings rates, and the X's are violent crime rates. And the point of this graph is to simply vividly show that violent crime rates are not associated with police killings rates. And that's one data point, but that's an important data point, because one wants to be attentive to the fact with how heavily they should weigh how effective police killings have been, or the use of police lethal force has been in reducing violent crime rates in particular areas. And based on this one graph, although you would want to look at more, it doesn't appear that there's any kind of a correlation. So that's an important data point to have as you make that decision. It's going to inform the kind of logics you develop in your head as to whether you should go forward with this policy or not. All right, staying with our focus on empiricism, I want to just point out one further way of thinking about the problem of police brutality in general, which in recent years has become frontline news. So the textbook offers a very helpful way of kind of breaking down the empirical evidence about the police lethal use of force, and particularly the prevalence of using lethal force when it's not necessary. And they point to three different dimensions of the problem. And one is the psychological dimension. And people have been drawn to do research on police to understand whether there's a police personality type. In short, the psychological explanation or the personality explanation is a rotten apple explanation. And you've heard this explanation virtually every time that an allegation of police brutality emerges. And that is, we have someone who draws their weapon too easily, is not following police procedure, but it's a one-off. They are a rotten apple. And that psychological explanation gets dismissed a lot, particularly by sociologists, because sociologists tend to understand the world in its cultural terms, and we focus less on kind of the personalities of individuals. But psychologists, to be fair, have shown some evidence that it does make sense to focus on kind of individual officers and to look at personality quirks or pathologies that those officers may have. And so how does that happen? How is it that police officers have these personality traits which are a danger to the public? And one reason is this idea of selection bias. And selection bias really refers to this idea that policing is this incredibly dangerous job that has lots of opportunities for giving people adrenaline rushes and giving them a tangible sense of doing good. And that particular type of occupation tends to draw, for complex reasons, particular kinds of candidates. It selects those candidates into the ranks of police officers. And it's that selection bias that tends to draw in the quote unquote bad apples. A second way to approach this idea of why there's a higher rate of officers who are attracted to the police force, who have pathological tendencies, can actually be explained by the nature of the job. Policing can have a lot of trauma associated with it. There's a lot of traumatic experiences, and there's other qualities of the job that come together and kind of cultivate certain personality issues or mental health issues within officers that over time lead them to become bad apples. And that's a little bit different than selection bias. Another way to think about the problem of police brutality is to let go of psychological explanations and to talk more about what I would call cultural explanations. And what a cultural explanation refers to characteristics which are in the cultural milieu or the cultural environment. You can kind of think of culture as a shared set of tools. And by the tools, I'm referring to different ideas about how the world works, a worldview, a ritualized approach to, almost ritualized approach to handling certain situations. These practices are not owned or invented by any single individual, but they're kind of the product of the community, and they're passed down to police officers. And that culture, they come together and form a culture. That culture can lead officers to behave in a particular way. So if we hope to address a cultural problem of police brutality, we really need to think in cultural terms. So that's one way to think about the problem. Just as an example of a cultural characteristic, the textbook often talks about how it's common among police officers to think about us versus them, meaning the police officers versus citizens, because citizens will never understand it from the police officer's perspective. And so that's a part, that viewpoint, that way of looking at the public that one serves might be in some departments a cultural feature, okay? And it might have some negative consequences for how that police department interacts with the public. A second cultural explanation is this notion of implicit bias. Implicit bias meaning the biases, often racist biases, but it's not just racism. They are the biases that we hold deep down inside. We often don't even know that we hold these biases. And then the final piece is what's called the organizational, or I would call it the structural. I think this is most straightforward. In other words, what this says is that the problem with police brutality is not because we have bad apples. In other words, there are no psychologically detectable problems with individual officers. It's not because we have a negative culture of policing. People who have been a part of a department can say that actually my department is very healthy, and of course it's not perfect, but there is no real strain of implicit bias, or there's no real us versus them mentality that's creating a problem. What the problem is that say a new police chief steps in and enacts a bunch of policies that have the effect of confusing people about what proper procedure is, or have the effect of somehow implementing a change within the organization that leads officers to police in a different way that has had the effect of creating more violent interactions with members of the public.